A queen from a desert caravan city seized Egypt, struck her own imperial coins, and, for a heartbeat, made Rome look provincial. How does a palace of sand rattle an iron empire? Rome unravels, emperors topple in months, borders bleed, plague bites, the treasury wheezes. On the eastern edge, Palmyra fattens on Silk Road tolls and shields the frontier from Persia. From that pressure steps Zenobia, learned, magnetic, suddenly gripping the levers of power no one meant to create. We'll chart her rapid ascent, decode coin imagery that quietly announces rebellion, and walk through a visual reconstruction of Palmyra, the mile-long colonnade and the Temple of Bel. Then we'll test the sources, what really happened after Aurelian caught her. Evidence first, myths on trial. Because empires don't really rise on speeches, they rise on logistics that work. This is armchair archaeology, where ruins become receipts and artifacts talk back. We blend gripping storytelling with responsible history so you leave entertained and better armed for internet debates. Stay to the end. There's a surprising place Zenobia may have spent her final years, and you can still visit it today. Mid-3rd century Rome breathes in ragged bursts. Emperors flash past the throne like sparks in wind. Legions auction their loyalty. Borders leak. Plague strips markets and barracks alike. The treasury thins until coins feel more silvered promise than silver. On the eastern horizon, the Sasanian frontier doesn't merely press, it pries, searching for seams in Rome's armor. Caravans pause at way stations that once ran like clockwork, calculating whether guides will show and whether a tax receipt still buys safety on the next stretch of road. When distant authority blurs, local clarity sharpens. City councils turn into crisis cabinets. Governors become problem solvers with swords. Palmyra, perched where Mediterranean hunger meets Mesopotamian supply, learns to do Rome's work without waiting for Rome, escorting caravans, bargaining with tribes, rationing risk. Its wealth isn't abstract, it's counted in tolls, camel trains, warehouse notes, and bilingual contracts that knit Aramaic pragmatism to Greek and Latin legalese. Protection, once a courtesy, becomes policy. Then a rumor arrives in hard daylight. At Edessa, Emperor Valerian falls into Persian hands, taken alive. Later storytellers will embroider the insult with stables and mounting steps. What matters is the shudder that follows. If emperors can be seized on campaign, then the spell that kept provinces deferential has already broken. Communities begin acting on the question they've been whispering. Who will actually show up? Across the map, crises travel in packs. The Danube flares, the Rhine spits raiders, villages thin, prices dance, and every town invents a workaround. Palmyra's answer is specific to its landscape. Desert cavalry that drinks little and rides far. Brokers who can turn a blood feud into a signed truce. Customs houses that double as war chests. On parchment and in dust, the city starts writing like a state. Orders, levies, guarantees, and finds the sentences come easily. By the time Rome notices, a caravan hub already thinks like a capital.
Palmyra sits where thirst meets profit, an oasis halfway between the Mediterranean's ports and the river worlds of Mesopotamia. Caravans arrive sunburned and dust-caked, bells clicking under camel jaws, then vanish into cool porticos where brokers tally loads with wooden counters and stamped notes. The city's genius isn't mystery, it's logistics. Water is rationed, pasture scheduled, guides assigned, and every stop priced. Safety isn't a promise, it's an invoice with a seal. Merchants speak in layers, Aramaic for home, Greek for contracts, Latin when a Roman officer wants numbers. That multilingual hum becomes an engine for order. Caravan guilds hire escorts, tribal sheiks sign transit guarantees, and disputes resolve under carved lintels rather than along the barrel of a spear. The streets advertise that harmony. Corinthian capitals beside local gods, toga folds painted across statues with Syrian eyes, inscriptions reading like bilingual business cards. Money moves through temples as much as markets. At the Temple of Bel, priests oversee endowments that look suspiciously like public finance, funds for roads, fountains, caravan police. One monumental inscription, the Palmyra tariff, spells out customs dues line by line in 2 languages, down to what a sack of myrrh or a bolt of silk costs to pass the gates. It's not just a religious city, it's a rule book carved in stone. Because risk is predictable, profit becomes scalable. Palmyra turns protection into product, with customs houses acting like insurance counters. The more caravans it shepherds, the more leverage it holds over neighbors and officials who need the goods to keep their own towns fed and appeased. A place that began as a watering stop accrues habits of sovereignty, appointing officers, fixing exchange rates, negotiating with kings as a peer rather than a petition. By the time Rome's attention frays, Palmyra isn't merely rich, it's used to giving orders. If stories like this, where trade quietly becomes power, change how the past makes sense, this is a place for you. Subscribe and keep following the evidence wherever it leads. And that's the tipping point, because cities that give orders don't wait for permission when power is up for grabs. Odaenathus read the desert like a ledger: wells, distances, grudges, prices. After Valerian's capture, Shapur, the Sasanian king, pressed west, and the usual imperial assurances thinned into rumor. Palmyra couldn't afford rumors. Odaenathus gathered riders who measured marches in thirst, not miles, and struck where supply lines kinked: convoys, depots, river crossings. Victories didn't come as fanfare, they came as absences: a Persian column that never arrived, a frontier town that never burned. Rome, frantic elsewhere, discovered a convenience. Palmyra was doing imperial work without draining imperial coffers. Honors followed: governorships, commands, the grand title corrector of the whole East, essentially an emergency overseer. Titles mattered because they legalized what was already true. His courts met, his soldiers were paid, his word traveled faster than orders from distant emperors. Merchants weighed that reliability and quietly shifted their bets. There was a day in Syria when the streets filled with color taken from Persian hands, embroidered standards, fine tack, bits of royal convoy gear, spoils that turned heads and settled arguments. People didn't need decrees to understand what that display meant. The Eastern War had a local champion who could bring trophies home and enemies to heel. Protection, once a service, had become identity. In modern terms, it was a press conference in fabric and gold. Power in the 3rd century was a season. Odaenathus's ended with an assassin slipping through celebration, a knife where a toast should have been. Assassinations usually unravel everything. This one didn't. The cavalry already knew its roots. Officers knew whom to pay and when. Tribal agreements were written in terms merchants could audit. What he built had habits. That attention to systems, roots, records, and reliability is the idea behind the ancient secrets mug, made as a desk companion for slow, methodical thinking. It's linked in the pinned comment for those who value process over myth. In the silence after the funeral drums, the problem sharpened. The army still needed a voice it would obey. Creditors still expected schedules kept. Neighbors still watched the horizon. Palmyra had a template and an inheritance. It also had a regent who understood both. The machinery kept turning, waiting for the hand that would keep it running and raise its ambitions.
The funeral smoke thins, and governance doesn't wait. A child, Odaenathus, has the crown. The army needs signatures that make paydays real. Zenobia takes the seal and starts with continuity. Officers kept, routes guarded, tributes collected on the day they're due. Stability reads well on ledgers and in tents. Yet the handwriting on those orders is unmistakably hers, precise, multilingual, confident about what Palmyra owes the world and what the world now owes Palmyra. Court ritual shifts. Audiences include scholars alongside captains. Letters to cities travel in the Greek of diplomacy. Petitions at home read in Aramaic. Roman envoys, when they come, hear Latin responses that don't wobble. The city has known wealth and defense. It now performs statehood. Processions have a new cadence, a queen riding among cavalry, helm catching the sun, the air beside her. No manifesto announced it, but soldiers and merchants share the same conclusion. Authority sounds different, and it rides well. Genealogy becomes policy. In statues and speeches, Zenobia's image leans eastward and backward, hints of Cleopatra's lineage, a crown line that threads through dynasties to make Palmyra feel older than the moment. It isn't nostalgia, it's leverage. If Palmyra defends the frontier and feeds the markets, why pretend it's only a client? Edicts begin to speak in the first person of a guardian who has outgrown guardianship. Territory answers to that voice. Garrisons take instructions from Palmyra before orders arrive from Rome. Allies accept arbitration that saves blood and coin. Governors who once waited for imperial replies discover that the fastest decision comes from the oasis. Coins and titles will later reveal what words already imply, but the program starts here. A learned queen translates trade strength into a governing habit and makes obedience feel routine. By the time courtiers realize that regent has become too small a word, the map has already adjusted. The palace doors open onto a capital, not a caretaking office. By the time anyone objects, Palmyra is no longer governed, it is governed from.
Control of Egypt isn't a border tweak, it's a hand on Rome's throat. Wheat rides the Nile like clockwork, feluccas stacked with sacks, sailors counting the flood, scribes chalking tallies on dockside posts, then pours through Alexandria into sea lanes that feed the capital's grain dole, the subsidized rations that keep crowds calm and politics quiet. Disrupt that flow, and senators grow brave in the worst way, hungry. Zenobia's planners understood the equation and moved before the math could change. Palmyrene columns reached Alexandria, not to sack its libraries or scorch its quays, but to capture its schedules. Granaries guarded, customs officers replaced, the harbor kept open on new authority. Alexandria is a city that tests rulers. It plays factions like instruments and has seen emperors blink. Here, the message had to be competence first, banners second. Garrisons were paid on time, transshipment kept a timetable, and local elites courted with the language they respected, predictability. The propaganda wrote itself. Palmyra wasn't stealing grain, it was saving order from Rome's absentee management. Think of a modern state leveraging a shipping canal. Manage the choke point, manage the narrative. Evidence survives in papyri, paper-like documents, from the dust of offices. Administrative notices begin to date by unfamiliar names, pairing Aurelian with Odaenathus, and in some cases giving pride of place to the Palmyrene side. Routine receipts and duty lists carry that pairing as if it were obvious. It's the quiet kind of revolution, no proclamation, just office work aligning to a new center. The risk, of course, is that efficiency looks like rebellion once the emperor regains his breath. Holding Egypt paints a target in imperial red. Yet relinquishing it would have collapsed the authority that made soldiers and merchants listen in the first place. So the occupation hardened into administration. Nile patrols staffed, warehouses sealed with fresh marks, Alexandrian coinage reflecting a calculus that dared Rome to call the bluff. From the desert's edge, Palmyra had learned to monetize safety. In Egypt, it learned to monetize legitimacy. Grain ships leaving on time under a different umbrella,
and a Mediterranean that woke to find its most important timetable kept by a queen in the east. Once you control the food clock, politics follows, whether Rome likes it or not. Next, the money itself starts talking. At this point, does Zenobia look more like Rome's stabilizer or its inevitable rival? Where do you think legitimacy actually tipped?
Before Aurelian marches east, power can be argued in speeches or carved on architraves, but it's hardest to ignore when it clinks in your palm. In the early phase of Palmyra's ascendancy, new issues from Eastern mints do something careful. They pair Aurelian, the Roman emperor, with Odaenathus, the Palmyrene heir. One face shows the imperial portrait, flip it, and a local prince appears with a string of ranks, honors that sound loyal, yet stretch the fabric of loyalty. Every market stall that makes change is suddenly a bulletin board, like a banknote today quietly normalizing who's in charge. Portraits tell on their owners. The radiate crown, spiky rays that signal imperial aura, begins to sit on Odaenathus's head in some issues, where on paper he is still subordinate. Titles tiptoe forward: Rex, king, and Dux Romanorum, leader of the Romans, read as cooperation. Imperator and Augustus, emperor, imply parity. Die engravers adjust busts accordingly, shaving or swelling the jawline, tuning the gaze from deferential to direct. Aurelian's laureate head still commands one side, but the other no longer looks like a junior partner waiting for permission. Metal speaks geography. Antioch and Alexandria strike these uneasy compromises, flooding Syria and Egypt with coins that normalize a two-headed arrangement. Rome's name for legitimacy, Palmyra's for administration. Shopkeepers don't parse constitutional nuance, they track supply. If taxes are paid and soldiers don't plunder, the portrait that buys bread becomes the portrait that feels right. The shift isn't announced, it accumulates. Legends tighten, wreaths thicken, and reverses praise Virtus and Securitas, as if the gods themselves endorse the new balance. Even whispers of Zenobia styled as Augusta, whether on official issues or allied propaganda, signal how the court thinks about itself. The coins aren't souvenirs of rebellion, they are its operating system, circulating a claim thousands of times a day. When the emperor in the West finally steadies his grip, these small discs have already trained half the East to read Palmyra into the imperial script. Call that treason if you like. In Antioch's markets and Alexandria's docks, it felt like a workflow that made sense. That's how rebellion really spreads, not by speeches, but by becoming normal. Rome starts to move. Aurelian inherits a map frayed at every edge and starts by stitching, not boasting. Danube legions get drilled until formations click like gears. Supply officers who skim are replaced by men who count barley by the handful. The emperor's reputation travels faster than his banners, strict, relentless, sleep light. He doesn't promise to restore the world, he behaves as if restoration is an errand already underway. Once the northern fires are banked, his attention turns east, where a two-name system, Aurelian on one face, Odaenathus on the other, has become habit. He knows the danger of letting habit harden into law. The march is tuned for speed. Detachments sized to move light, scouts tasked to find water before glory, quartermasters told to feed horses first. Cities along the route calculate their odds and decide gates can be symbols or doors. They choose doors. Each surrender peels away a layer of Palmyrene confidence more efficiently than any grandstand battle. When he takes the field in Syria, the difference is visible from the saddle. Palmyrene cavalry rides like a mirage, fast and wide. Aurelian answers with formations that bend, absorb, then bite at the hinge where momentum stalls. After one clash, the field yields more than prisoners, letters, supply notes, and pay rosters that map the Palmyrene system like veins under skin. The paperwork confirms what rumor suggested. This rival isn't a raiding confederation, it's an organism. Aurelian speaks as much in amnesty as in iron. Cities that switch sides are folded back in with titles kept, taxes moderated, a future promised if they stop trying to write their own. It's closer to a reconstruction plan than a purge. Keep the managers, change the letterhead. The message lands. Cooperation comes with continuity, resistance with erasure. Antioch wavers and learns caution. Emesa holds and bleeds. By the time the emperor nears Palmyra's heartlands, he's taken caravans from the road and certainties from the calendar. The Eastern Empire that once felt inevitable now looks negotiable. That's when Zenobia has to choose, wait behind walls or ride for help beyond the Euphrates.
Palmyra faces east and west at once. Its colonnades promise order. Its hinterland teaches caution. When Aurelian standards appear beyond the oasis, routine becomes rationing. Granaries are sealed, wells watched, horse grain measured to the fist. Scouts ride out at dusk and return with arithmetic. How many tents? How much fodder? How fast the ring is tightening. The city has survived on timing. Sieges punish timing. The walls hold longer than rumor expects. Desert cavalry dart from side gates, stinging supply lines and disappearing into glare. Merchants who once tallied incense now count arrowheads. In the courtyards, you can hear two kinds of leadership. The voice that says endurance will prove legitimacy, and the one that insists movement is survival. News from Antioch and Emesa suggests a pattern. Cities opened their gates and kept their lives. Palmyra weighs that mercy against the habit of deciding for itself. Aurelian sends terms that read like a balanced ledger. Keep status, keep property, keep peace, and the past is filed. Acceptance tempts and offends. The queen chooses risk. One done, the gates do not open for parley, but for speed. A small escort rides hard toward the Euphrates, following the old spine of caravan wells toward the only ally left with armies enough to matter. Sand lifts, hooves drum, and the Euphrates flashes too late. Roman riders are faster than anyone wished. The capture is quick, almost quiet, the kind of event history later inflates because the moment itself allowed no speech. Inside the walls, calculation replaces hope. Palmyra submits. The emperor enters not as a butcher, but as a bookkeeper who is closed in account. For a while, the city breathes. Then a second uprising flares, desperation more than strategy, and Aurelian answers with the lesson he'd postponed. Garrisons are purged, defenses torn down, treasure redistributed as warning. The oasis endures, diminished. Columns still throw their long shadows, but authority has shifted. The desert superstate becomes a memory under audit. After the capture, the story forks. Roman audiences expected a triumph, and they got one. Crowds, laurel crowns, wagons of spoils, a pageant of a restored world. Somewhere in that procession walked a queen whose name the city already knew. Later writers embroider the scene with theatrical detail. Heavy jewels, a headdress that pulled the neck, chains that glittered more than they bit. The spectacle reads like a sentence, but the archives murmur a quieter outcome. Aurelian was a pragmatist who liked his victories to fund the next march. Amnesty could be propaganda. Cities that surrendered kept their elites. Governors who bent the knee kept their houses. In that logic, a single captive could be more useful as a living example than a martyr. Several late traditions place Zenobia not in a cell, but in a villa near Tibur, modern Tivoli, the hill country east of Rome, where the air cools and gardens step down toward the river. The rumor isn't a fairy tale grafted onto a tragedy. It fits a ruler's habit of turning enemies into ornaments of order. The sources don't harmonize. One paints humiliation, another a learned matron receiving philosophers, a Roman husband, children with Latin names. The outlandish bits give themselves away. Bronze chains that weigh a person to the ground without crushing bone. But shards line up. An emperor who staged mercy, a senate that prized spectacle, and a state in a place where exiles and retirees mixed. Even the coins and titles that once shouted rebellion become part of the display case. Rome has absorbed the noise. What matters for the Ark isn't whether the house in Tivoli still holds a shadow of her footfall. It's that the legend ends with survival. The queen who jolted the map reappears as a neighbor. The foreign made domestic, the rebel made precedent for what Rome can swallow and still call itself whole. It's a tactic we still recognize. Absorb the rival, claim continuity, move on. In the gap between parade and porch lies the contradiction the empire used to teach its lesson. Power punishes. Power also curates. Zenobia, inconveniently, proved it could do both.
Walk the colonnade first. A stone boulevard just over a kilometer long, columns marching in files, sun striking acanthus leaves that artisans drilled until they looked soft. Midway, the tetrapylon, a four-way arch, once framed crossings like a stage set, 4 clusters of pillars, each platforming statues that turned traffic into ceremony. Brackets on the shafts held honorific figures with inscriptions below, a street that doubled as a public resume, where donors and caravan leaders advertised virtue in limestone letters. Turn into the sanctuary of Bel. The precinct sprawled like a small town, propylaea, courtyards, banqueting rooms, a cella, the inner shrine, whose roof once carried a coffered sky. Reliefs mixed local deities with a classical grammar, a theological handshake visible at a glance. Our reconstruction rethreads the pigments most visitors never imagine, ochres and reds along moldings, gilding where the sun would catch it in late afternoon. The classical beige is a modern habit. Palmyra was never shy about color. Beyond the forum spaces, the dead kept their own avenues. Tower tombs rose like stacked rooms for memory. Inside, loculi, burial niches, sealed with sculpted portraits, faced the visitor head-on. Direct gazes, patterned hair, jewelry picked out with paint, Aramaic captions stating lineage and pride. Descend into an underground hypogeum, a chambered tomb. Wall paintings glow, stone benches line the walls, and the quiet still feels occupied. Then the modern rupture. In the 2010s, militants shattered temples, the arch and towers. An archaeologist who had guarded the site lost his life. The loss is not only architectural, it is civic and personal, felt by families whose histories are written into those stones. Yet the record did not vanish. Survey drawings, photographs, satellite passes, even tourist snapshots became raw material for careful models built by archaeologists and conservators. Teams debate not whether to forget, but how to remember. Stabilize ruins as scars, reconstruct select elements as teaching tools, or leave absence to speak.
What the site proves, despite ruin, is that Palmyra organized itself through beauty and contracts. Even broken, the colonnade explains the city's habits: to honor, to negotiate, to be seen. The desert kept those habits in stone. History asks us to keep them in mind. Here's the reveal we promised. After Aurelian's triumph, a strong tradition places Zenobia not in a dungeon, but in a villa near Tibur, modern Tivoli, just east of Rome, living as a respected matron with Roman connections. The rebel empress who once held Egypt and minted imperial claims may have ended her days among terraced gardens and cool hill air, hosting philosophers instead of generals. It's debated, yes, but it fits Aurelian's habit of turning mercy into message. And it flips the legend. Rome didn't erase her, it absorbed her. Across this episode, we traced the crisis that cracked the empire, the trade machine that made Palmyra bold, the campaigns that built its sword hand, and the coins that turned courage into policy. We walked the colonnade, stepped into Bel's precinct, and faced the modern losses that scar the site, and the careful work that keeps its memory precise. It funnels into one idea: power is logistics wearing a crown, and identity is what survives when crowns fall. If this reframed how you see Zenobia, tell me which piece of evidence felt most convincing: the coins, the papyri, or the Tivoli tradition, and why? Would you have taken Aurelian's terms or ridden for Persia? Share, comment, and subscribe to Armchair Archaeology for evidence-driven ancient stories, and tap the bell so you don't miss the next dig. Now jump to your next stop, our last video, How Babylon Built the Universe from a Corpse, or the full Ancient Middle East playlist for the big picture, both on screen and in the description. Until next time, keep questioning, stay curious, and remember, tomorrow has always been ancient. Their contracts were carved in stone, their rebellions struck in silver, and their echoes still move through our maps.